So just to introduce the panel, I have two really experienced, knowledgeable panelists alongside with me. As I mentioned, my name is Erica Anderson. I am the VP of Marketing for iGaming North America here at Paysafe. And I have on the panel with me from Interac, Danny Kotsopoulos, who's the Director of Product Management there. And I'll let you, Danny, introduce yourself.
Thanks, Erica. Good morning, everyone. Danny Kotsopoulos, and I've been at Interac for about 5 years, and I manage a lot of the product management function across a lot of the core products that we offer. So that includes the debit portfolio, the e-commerce portfolio, as well as the cash portfolio and money movement. So the e-transfer side of the business as well. So I have a kind of good mix across each one of those. And prior to Interac, I think I was at one of the large FIs and doing a lot of the same kind of product management functions.
Perfect. Thank you for the intro. And alongside him, I also have here Daniel Kornitzer from Paysafe. He's the Chief Business Development Officer. Daniel, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Eric, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be back at the summit, hopefully next time in person. I'm based in Montreal. I'm a technologist at heart, and I lead strategic partnerships and enterprise sales across the Paysafe group. I'm looking forward to this discussion this morning. Perfect.
So just to give you a bit background on the panel, I know I introduced the topic and a little bit about Paysafe. So Paysafe we are a leading specialized payments provider. We work globally, but also we have our roots in Canada in the Canadian market. So very much focused for this panel. We focus on different payment solutions, payment processing, both in-store and online, as well as digital wallets and online cash solutions. We have several brands that fall under us, like NetTeller and Skrill and Paysafe Card. And in Canada, we really have roots in iGaming, working with different iGaming operators, as well with the Canadian lotteries, the provincial lotteries, along with large retailers and e-commerce retailers like Macaj online, as well as Metro and Desjardins. So our roots are really in payments. We know it. We've been doing it for over 25 years. And also, we have partnerships with Interac as well. So today we're going to get into really pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. What changes have there been in the marketplace in terms of payments? So we're really looking at, has there been a change in payment preferences? What has changed? What do we see for the future? 86% of Canadians, Americans, and Europeans changed their payment habits, according to our research, since the start of the pandemic. And we really want to look at the reasons behind it, how it affects what you choose as your payment options, and really how the consumer and business relationship is changing. So to get started, I wanted to just allow Daniel, I knew this was going to happen, Daniel and Danny. Daniel, can you start a little bit on our Canadian consumer research? I just referenced a little bit about it, but can you give us a bird's eye view of what we're seeing in card present and card not present payments in early 2020 before the pandemic?
Sure. So one of the things we've been doing for many years now is that we run our own proprietary market research. So in the case of consumers, we survey something like 8,000 people, typically in 7-8 countries, of course, including Canada, the US, Europe, and now we started in LATAM as well with Brazil. When we early in the pandemic in April 2020, we ran our first study of 8,000 consumers, and some of the key findings. First of all, we all noticed that e-commerce essentially doubled within 2 months. So I guess the pandemic put digital transformation on steroids. So e-commerce went from 15% of total transactions to about 30%, basically overnight. And some of the takebacks from that initial piece of research back in April 2020 showed that, for example, people were conflicted about cash. So 54% reduced their cash usage for fear of catching the virus by touching the notes. But at the same time, an almost equal number of consumers were concerned about losing access to cash at ATMs and stuff. They didn't like the idea that maybe they wouldn't be able to access their cash. So kind of a conflicted attitude towards cash. Obviously, contactless went through the roof, with 74% of people citing that contactless is more convenient than cash, and 59% of people increasing usage. And I think the higher limits also helped, where people could tap to pay, and the limits were much higher, enabling an even larger percentage of transactions to be done contactlessly. 44% of people shop more online, and interestingly, 15%, 1/5, did a first online transaction in their lives, I guess. Globally, that figure is 20%. So 1 in 5 consumers did their very first transaction in the early months of the pandemic. And something that's interesting, oftentimes the changes in attitudes start with the sort of the younger demographics. But in here, some people talk about silver commerce. Many people of the slightly older generations did their first online transactions for the first time. So that's kind of a nutshell. We can give a link to the full research, but that was those were the early findings back in April 2020.
That's really good. Sets the stage for where we're at before. Danny, do you want to give your input based on your data from Interac and your experience, whether you agree or disagree with Daniel?
Absolutely. Yeah, I do agree with Daniel. The pre-pandemic, though, definitely we were starting to see Canadians well on the path of embracing electronic payments as a way to replace check and cash use. So between 2014 and 2019, in that 5-year period, we were seeing cash volumes decreasing by 5% year over year. And most of the transactions were migrating to card payments. And on the debit side, the growth that we were seeing within the debit portfolio was largely driven by contactless payments. So prior to the pandemic, right up to the pandemic, or right before the pandemic, the percentage or the proportion of all of the debit POS transactions that were completed using a tap, either tapping a phone or a mobile device, made up 50% of all of those transactions. And in 2019, the year-over-year contactless volumes had grown by 15%. And the large kind of driver of that was mobile contactless. And it's growing at a faster clip as Canadians were adopting mobile use more prevalently. And so, in fact, actually 30% of debit card holders had regularly tapped their mobile device, either using to make a payment with their debit card. From an e-commerce perspective, the foundation was already there to accelerate that growth once the pandemic hit. Around 86% of Canadian consumers made an online purchase in 2019. And for those that did not have access to credit, so either the younger population or the unbanked population, they were using prepaid cards or debit cards to engage in their e-commerce transactions.
That makes sense. So from, in terms of when the pandemic actually hit, and then, we went through lockdowns in 2020, 2021, what changed for the retail, whether in-store or online? Danny, what did you see in the changes? And then, in the actual reach in the card present and non-present space, what changes did you see and why?
Yeah, absolutely. And the impact that we saw was immediate, where we saw the spending patterns for cash and debit either completely dropped off because nothing was open where you can actually spend your money, or we were seeing a quick migration over towards e-commerce or even to e-transfer services. Cash and debit took a significant hit of about 40 to 50% year-over-year drop we were seeing in transactions. And cash was most significantly impacted, and we started to see, even as the pandemic kind of continued on, the recovery on the cash side has been much slower. So that's a strong indication that there is a permanent migration away from cash towards digital options. However, as Daniel was saying, in terms of the conflict on that, while we saw the occurrences of with cash withdrawals dropping, the average withdrawal amount actually increased by 45%. So went from about $180 to about $260. And this is also supported, I guess, by the Bank of Canada in 2020, where they estimated that there was $17 billion more in more cash in circulation as Canadians were hoarding cash for spend over time. And when I look at it, it's a truly indication of consumers or Canadians really being careful about managing what type of contact they have with the terminals, because they don't know, at that point they weren't sure about the transmissibility of the virus and things like that, so they were just managing that. So maybe instead of going to the bank machine twice to do withdrawal, I go once and take out more money. On the debit side, while the volumes took a pretty big hit, that low point in volumes only lasted less than 2 months. So we had pretty quick recovery patterns happening on the debit side, and that's driven by, I think, 4 main factors. First, Canadians just adjusting that this is not a 2-week shutdown, 2-week stay at home. It's going to be a new normal, if you will, and they just need to adjust how they're going to venture into the world, if you will. As well, a good base of the debit volumes are attributed to essential retail spend. So drugstores, grocery stores. So there's which were less impacted by some of the retail closures. So or the restrictions. So we would see a bounce back happening from that front, or a migration of spend that would have happened at restaurants. You would start to see the pickup happening in grocery stores and the spending there. So it was also shifting between different MCC verticals that were happening. Then we also saw a kind of reflection of how consumers or Canadians were spending their time, and that was reflected in our data as well. So more people were staying at home, so we started to see more renovation. So hardware sales was starting to increase. So we're seeing more renovation, gardening, those types of spend starting to increase. And then as well, the acceleration towards contactless payments. As I said, pre-pandemic, the proportion of transactions was 50%. By the end of that summer, that proportion had increased to 60%. And that's a pretty sizable increase given what the pre-pandemic month-over-month spending looked like. So we had seen a 20% year-over-year increase in that contactless spend. So that was a big driver of some of that recovery in the debit volumes.
Yeah,
from an online space. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, so from around e-commerce sales, the demand for the online solutions was reflected in a over 300% year-over-year increase in our debit payments that were processed either via merchant app or website. So definitely we also saw a shift in the types of that spend that was happening online, similar to the debit side. Well, we saw a spike in food delivery apps, or as well as online gaming. So as you're spending more time at home, there's a portion of the population that's where they would spend their time, for, I guess, recreationally. And then interestingly, we weren't anticipating, but it was a great news story seeing that the kind of spike that we were seeing on the e-transfer side in response to the unavailability or the drop in cash and debit. So there was a 113% year-over-year increase in the e-transfer transactions that were received by businesses across Canada. So from March 20 to April 2021, the active business users grew by 27%, which is more than double that growth rate of the platform's overall kind of active user base. And then lastly, I think when we looked at half Canadians were also, when we surveyed it, half of the Canadians also gave us, stated that they were just as comfortable paying with e-transfer as any of the other payment forms. So, and as the pandemic continued on, we definitely saw new and different ways that they were using that. For example, 18% of Canadians said that they used e-transfer to purchase from a local business, which were most most impacted by the restrictions. So there was that kind of groundswell support around local businesses. So we definitely saw that reflected within the e-transfer volumes. 19% said that they used it for takeout, and 14% used it to pay a tradesperson. So similar to definitely linkages between what we were seeing on the debit side in terms of the home renovations and hardware, those types of things. So definitely there were common themes and connectivity where we saw drops in volumes in some services with a corresponding increase on the other side.
Well, thank you for sharing that. So Daniel, on your perspective, I'm not sure if that's my mic that's making that or if that's someone else. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So Daniel, from your perspective and from Paysafe's research that we did in 2020 and 2021 during the lockdowns, what did we see and what did the consumers say from that?
Yeah, no, and I totally agree with Danny's perspective on the changes that occurred in the in consumer attitudes here in Canada and more broadly around the world. So we went back to the well and carried out a second survey of consumers in March, April 2021, so roughly a year into the pandemic. And the key insights from that research are that 86% of consumers changed their payment habits during the pandemic, and 59%, so 3 out of 5, tried a brand new payment method, brand new to them, of course, with 21% using a digital or a mobile wallet. And I think that the key there is, and we actually did a separate survey, this time of merchants, later in the year in October 2021, where we essentially asked the merchant side of the story, what changes are you seeing in consumer attitudes? And maybe the common point there is that the diversity of the checkout, increased dramatically. It may be a bit of a new thing for us here in Canada, but if you look at it globally, in Germany, only 30% of people have a credit card. In Peru, 78% of people are unbanked. So options like e-cash or online cash are very relevant. So the rest of the world tends to be much more, I guess, in tune with the use of alternate payment methods, whereas in North America in general, we're more card focused. But this seems to be to some extent changing when in the October 2021 survey, when we asked merchants, 33% support mobile wallets, 21% e-cash, 20% crypto. But more interestingly, a very large number of merchants said that they were planning to add different payment methods in the following 2 years. Something like over 50% of those merchants mentioned that they wanted to add other payment methods, including crypto, cash, and mobile wallets. So there's definitely a push towards kind of broadening the options that are offered to the consumer.
Yeah, and Daniel, you talked a little bit about the merchants, and just quickly to finish off this section talking about during the pandemic, Danny or Daniel, do you have any comments on how the merchants are changing? You said about the future, about adding new payment methods, but how did they adapt during this period?
Well, the adaptation, I think, was brutal for if you for the small merchants that, for example, weren't offering an online option. If your store has to be closed, and if you're selling, if you're a restaurant and you cannot sell in person, then either you find a way to allow people to order and do delivery, or pretty much you have to close shop. So it kind of forced many of these merchants, especially the smaller ones. I'm assuming that the bigger ones already had online operations, but for the smaller ones, it was either find a way to allow people to order and have it delivered, or basically shut down the operation. So and of course contactless, as people didn't want to hold the keypad or even touch it. So as Danny was saying, people felt that using contactless was much more conducive to keeping the social distancing. So merchants had, by sheer necessity, had no choice but to make changes to the way they accepted payments and deliver their goods.
Makes sense. Adapting. So moving to the kind of the near future and then the longer future of what's next. I mean, you talked a little bit, Daniel, about, and you both talked about consumer and merchant. Danny, with the retail restrictions being lifted for the most part, do you see the changed payment preferences as being a new normal? Or do you feel that, when this pandemic, I don't think it'll ever really fully be over, but when it lightens a little bit, will we revert back to a more of a transactional normal or a transactional norm of before? Can you give a few comments on that? Oh, you're on mute, I think. You're still on mute.
Hearing back now.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Absolutely. And I think I look at this from kind of two angles. The first is that although restrictions have been largely lifted, I think we're still feeling the residual impact, as you were saying, Erica. One is we need to, the spend behaviors continue to be redefined. So the normal pattern and the day-to-day activities and routines of a lot of Canadians have changed. So, and we will continue to see that as a lot of organizations change from a full in-person work environment to, say, remote work styles. So so we will not necessarily see the same type of every morning I'm going for my going to the office, I can stop and get my coffee. You probably won't have some of that activity, and that's kind of being shifted. As well, the inflationary pressures related to the supply chain issues that were kind of driven by the pandemic are still going to be felt for the immediate term. So what we're starting to see is as the cost of living and some of those costs are starting to increase, it's affecting how Canadians are spending. So in a recent survey, we found that all generations had a concern around that increased cost of living, and about 6 out of 10 Canadians stating that they're more cautious about their finances than ever before. And we're also seeing that, in particular, younger Canadians turning to debit as a way to stay in control of their finances. So about 72% of millennials and 2/3 of the Gen Z population believe that Canadians should be able to use debit no matter if they're checking out online, making a purchase in-app, or in person. The other part that's kind of driving in terms of the channel of choice, if you will, is that's related to supply chain is actually on the inventory availability. So with some of the supply chains, you may not have products available all the time. That may drive it. So if I can only find something I want to buy online that's not available, but and I prefer to buy it online, but it's available in the store, I will go. That may change that kind of the channel that you're going to shop in. The bigger kind of piece around whether whether we would revert back to more traditional styles or not, I think it's going to be a reimagining of how everything is working, how retail and the different roles that the different channels are playing. So the retail industry, what has ended up happening is that what was considered innovation a couple of years ago, like the curbside pickups, buy online, pay in store, those types of things are changing, and they're considered table stakes. So customers are now looking more towards connecting across multiple channels or consistency across those channels. And one interesting outcome related to the accelerated e-commerce growth is that it's given rise to increased online competition. So it's harder to create a differentiated offering for you when there's so many more online e-commerce retailers available, and then as a result, that's increasing acquisition costs. So what has ended up happening is that the brick and mortar is going to is having a resurgence, but it's going to be a little different, where the brick and mortar is now going to look to play more of an acquisition strategy. So it's an opportunity for consumers or Canadians to explore new products, go into a store, feel, experience, touch, those types of things of what that product looks like. Also a way of kind of creating local community presence around your brand for many of the retailers. And then frankly, also kind of cutting the noise or disconnecting from some of that digital world, right? So having that space there. And then that kind of trend is being supported by what is actually happening within the retail leasing or the availability space. So retail footprints are changing where a lot of retailers are opting for smaller spaces. So they're going to optimize that in different ways. So it's no longer going to have a full inventory base. It's going to be a little bit of a different mix. Or as well as the fact that retail space is more available and it's probably more affordable. You're seeing a more native online brands that are actually kind of moving towards a physical space. So at the end of the day, what's end up happening is the retail in-store experience is going to become more of a way to build connections. So either through like showrooming or pop-ups and things like that.
Interesting. From the transactional relationship, and I know you talk a little bit about it, Danny, but from your perspective, do you agree in kind of what he sees as the future, but also how the transactional relationship has changed and whether it's for the better or not? Could you give a little insight on that? Daniel?
Yeah, so look, I think that, you know, in general, my view is that maybe to put it in a colorful way, the toothpaste is not going back into the tube. I mean, people have learned that they can do online. We talked about, you know, silver commerce. We talked about just, you know, roughly 1 out of 5 or maybe 1 out of 6 in Canada that have tried, you know, online and mobile ordering for the first time. And it's not just the pandemic. There's a lot of stuff going on in parallel in terms of technology, changes to the regulatory environment. So on one hand, you've got the fact that people are not about to forget that online works well. And on the other hand, you've got things like open banking. You've got the emergence of real-time local rails in Canada, but also mirroring what's happening elsewhere in the world. In India, for example, you've got UPI. In Brazil, you've got Pix, with, you know, almost, you know, super inexpensive real-time push or pull payment methods. So in Brazil, within a little more than a year, you have over 100 million people using Pix. And that's the level of transformation that's occurring globally. So that means more competition, more innovation. And of course, the regulators are you know, kind of, on one hand, they want to encourage the innovation and the competition. On the other, they want to preserve the solidity of the financial systems and make sure that the new actors that come into play do not in any way put the let's say the safety of the financial networks at risk. But there is a lot going on. Then you've got the influence of artificial intelligence, which I would call sort of mass personalization. McKinsey talks about the new customer intimacy, being able to bring offers that are relevant to the consumer. This is not about spamming a consumer. This is about recreating the relationship that consumers used to have with mom and pop stores before the emergence of the Walmarts, the Amazons, the Costcos, right? That relationship we used to have by knowing the owner, the chef of a restaurant, the owner of a clothing store, that they knew our taste and our likings. We've kind of lost it with the great advances in sort of mass distribution and the economies of scale that came with it. But we've lost that personal touch. AI holds the promise to bring back that level of mass personalization, but this time using technology to, again, the objective is to make the consumer feel appreciated for their patronage, you know, feeling valued and not just a number. No one wants to be a number. There is something else that I found interesting is that even today, with all the advances and the new technology, and again, it may vary by country, but roughly globally, about 30% of consumers find that their online shopping experience is difficult. And that is both a problem and an opportunity, because anyone that can solve that issue and ease those interactions, provide a more seamless way of doing the purchasing process, can potentially gain an incredible upside, because 30% is not a small number. And obviously these people are not encouraged to buy again because they're not enjoying the process of buying online. And again, things like biometry, artificial intelligence, all the tools that are being put in place could create an environment where you can provide both convenience and security at the same time, which is kind of the holy grail, because that ultimately is what every consumer and every merchant aspires to. So a lot of, it's kind of a confluence of things. There's the lingering impacts, the pandemic, in terms of changing of consumer attitudes, people having experienced stuff, and the technology providing sort of game-changing components, including biometry, AI, and we haven't talked about blockchain and decentralization, but open banking, real-time transfers, very cost-effective. So all of that together, I think it's creating a great environment for innovation and new services to be brought to the consumer.
Thanks, Daniel. So Danny, do you see, Daniel touched on it and you touched on it a little. Do you see that our payments relationship as Canadian consumers is going to change to be a cashless society? With our technological changes, do you even predict, even from a credit card perspective, that it could lose its position as being the higher level king of payments, and moving more to debit cards and APMs, or how do you see that?
I think that it's although the pandemic has had a shift in the attitudes and the willingness to adapt to different payment forms, the kind of looking at the kind of segmentation of the populations, there's always going to be, or the different types of segments of customers and the types of users, there will always be a curve where when you're younger, you prefer to use debit, or if you're kind of unbanked population, you prefer to use debit. And then as you kind of grow older, you may graduate over towards using credit cards and things like that. So I think that those undertones will always be there. So within those veins, I don't think that you will see an environment where it will be totally cashless environment. So although the cash had taken a hit, we've seen a recovery start to happening on the cash side. So I don't think it's necessarily going to. I think it will not. I don't believe that it will probably ever return to the place where it was before. But I think that there's still going to be a place or a universe or a place for that spend, and that's going to continue. I think the piece around the credit card is that we need to, I think this is one of the trends within the online space, is there needs to be, there's more focus on having more ways to pay. So currently there's still exists a high kind of cart abandonment rate. So it could be related to the payment form or the payment acceptance of the different payment types and things like that. So to manage some of the cart abandonment and increase conversion rates, there will definitely have to be a space where it's like, okay, support me as a consumer and the choices and the preference that I have in terms of the way that I want to pay. And so that will always continue to be a driver where you will have a space for debit versus credit versus cash, those types of spend. And then that kind of ties into some of the other changes that are happening around, ties into subscription models. So I think what's happening within the industry in terms of as a way to kind of keep customers coming back and minimize the acquisition costs and things like that. So I think those are some of the trends that we'll start seeing a little bit more in terms of the future. And related to that, the customer consent. So with more regulatory oversight in terms of making sure that you have consent to store and access data. I think that's going to be a kind of a growing focus over the next few years, particularly as you put in the control in the hands of the consumer in terms of how you share information, what information shared, and your comfort levels around that. And then that ties into kind of big data. So how do you shape the evolution of having those personalized customer experiences? And the last kind of piece that we're starting to see is we've seen kind of remnants or pieces of that in the past or even right now, but I think it's probably going to grow in terms of the evolution of social commerce. So, and using a lot of those kind of platforms, being able to kind of drive some of those sales, or how are retailers going to build the connection through their brand or through community with their customers and things like that. I think those are going to be a lot of the changes that are going to, I believe, that are going to drive some of the trends moving forward.
Makes sense. Actually, you talked a little bit about the changes, and obviously there are a few questions in the chat that have been coming up about Interac, the e-transfer payment option. With the widespread adoption of it, are the limits, for business, more businesses are using it, do you see that the limits are going to change or increase, or is there anything that you can give in terms of kind of looking ahead to the future of that?
Yeah, I think we definitely always look at that. I think there's also with kind of real-time rails and things like that, and faster payments and things like that. I think that there's a kind of limit component to that. But in terms of the business's adoption, that was one of the surprising things that we did see, or at least for me to see how quickly the turning to alternatives. And I believe I think Daniel was touching on this in terms of, the small and micro businesses were most hard impacted by the pandemic, and without having a online presence or the barriers or the technology or the cost barriers to kind of get there, particularly while you're dealing with shutdown and revenue pressures or having on that side, looking at e-transfer was a very easy opportunity to create an online space where, hey, you want to buy something online, instead of having to have a traditional kind of online solution in place, there is that kind of creativity coming in place. Well, hey, send me an e-transfer, or we'll do this transaction via e-transfer, and then I'll kind of send it out to you. So I think a lot of those types of, I think that the pandemic spurred a lot of that kind of creativity around that. Those ways for merchants to quickly adapt and pivot to what was actually happening in the world and the changing consumer expectations.
Interesting. Another question that came, so we are moving to the Q&A section. I kind of segued a little bit into that with the last question. But another question that came about e-transfer adoption is just about, do you see any issues with fraud and how that's handled? And would you have any guidance for banks or fintechs who are offering this payment option?
I think what ends up happening from a fraud perspective is we have a strong kind of fraud management system. So I think for those transactions, they are being monitored and things like that. So we work very closely with all of our participants to make sure that we manage the fraud. So as we grow, we're growing at it's prudently. So manage those fraud risks appropriately.
Makes sense. So some of the other questions that we did have were around the research findings that we were talking about. So one thing I wanted to mention, there were questions about the Paysafe research, the consumer research, and Daniel, do you want to talk a little bit about where people can find more information about loss in transaction?
Yes, absolutely. You can find it under the paysafe.com website, but I think we can also post the links to the actual reports on the chat so that people can. And there is several ones. I mentioned 2 consumer research reports and 1 merchant report, and then maybe others that we can post so that people can look at they're filled with data. I think that the interesting part here is I often equate alternate payment methods with a door to your store. If you're a merchant, adding a door to your store means more traffic, more conversion, more sales. And why would you not offer your consumer the chance to pay with cards, with Interac, with eCash, with digital wallets, with even crypto, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not about saying that one method is better than the other. It's just putting the consumer in the driver's seat and letting the consumer choose whatever works for him or her. That I think is the basic premise, and kind of letting the market go where it wants to go, as opposed to being prescriptive. But we'll post all the links, and you're more than welcome to look at the data. And it's very, not only is interesting, but it also contrasts, say, Canada with the States, with 3-4 countries in Europe, with Brazil, and you can look at the regional differences that sometimes are interesting, because in some areas we have the same view, and in others the gaps are quite significant.
Perfect. Yeah. So I will. I'll just share the link in the chat for everyone. And if you have any questions or I need any follow up, I believe there's our contact details, or you can message the Payment Summit Canada or visit paysafe.com for more details. Did Danny or Daniel, did you have anything that you wanted to say as closing comments? I think we have a couple minutes left. Was there anything you wanted to add, Danny, from your side?
No, I think I think what I had prepared, I think I covered most of it, or Daniel's kind of covered it as well. So
perfect. Yeah. So thank you everybody for your time. We have had a really good time. There are also the contact details. Like I said, you can visit paysafe.com for any details, or email Nick if you need to get the lost in transaction link, but I'll also put it in the chat. And as well for Interac, if you have any questions there, you can visit the website or get in contact with Darren. So thank you to you both for all of your time. We are finishing up a couple minutes early, but I think that really finishes what we want to talk about today. I hope that everyone found it really insightful and helpful. And like I said, please get in touch if you have any questions. And thank you both for being here.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.
Hope everyone enjoys the summit.